is Dr. Jonathan Greenberg, and this is the fifth episode of the mini-masterclass series. Today, we are going to be talking about Bach's Adagio from the G minor sonata for violin solo. In our first videos, we talked about the general principles of musical interpretation, and today we're going to start taking those principles and applying them to actual pieces of music. So when we go into looking at the what questions, the first questions that we must ask ourselves are about the general background of the music, about the composer, the style, etc. So when we come to look at Bach's music specifically, being the greatest Baroque composer and for sure with the most rich repertoire for violin, we have to go back and look at the style of playing that music. Now, I'm not going to go too much in depth right now into questions of historical performance and all of that. When we talk about playing Baroque music and the style of Baroque, there are questions that have to do with bow and bow usage, and there's questions to do with vibrato. I'm not going to go into that too much right now. There is a very, very wide range of how to interpret that music. And I think that what matters the most is to make informed choices. We have to know what we do know, and we have to know what Bach would have expected. We obviously cannot know what the music actually sounded like back then, but it is important to know the information that we do have. I highly recommend trying out playing with Baroque bows and with Baroque instruments for those that have the ability to do that. So next we have to look at the actual information that Bach gives us. Bach names this sonata. This is not one of the partitas. The partitas are dance collections. This is a sonata, which means those are movements that are purely instrumental without any structure of a dance, but purely musical structures. This specific movement is called Adagio. Adagio, unlike popular opinion, does not mean slow. Adagio means laid back. And that's it's a nuanced difference from just saying slow, laid back. Now, also, if you look at this music, a lot of times the slow movements that precede fugues, the next movement in the sonata is a fugue, are slow and oftentimes free and improvisational in their style. So that's something that we should take into account when we come to look at this music. Now, we're today going to be looking at the first phrase of this adagio. So the first question we ask ourselves when we look at the phrase is, what is the start of the phrase and what is the end of the phrase? In the case of Bach, this is often actually a very complicated question to answer. In this case, it isn't, because we have a very clear outline. But when we do come to look at a phrase, there are four factors that we want to look at. It is the harmony, the markings of the composer that sometimes tell us clear indications, the melody, and the rhythm. I like to call it, to remember, H2MR, H-double-M-R. Okay, so harmony, markings, melody, rhythm. What is the structure of the phrase? Now that we already know where the phrase starts and the phrase ends, what is the structure of it? In our case here, we're going to have four chords, and four times that we hear all the voices. We have a piece with multiple voices, as we can see here, which is very common for Bach solo pieces. So we have the four chords, and then we have three short phrases that connect between those chords. And then one of the most important questions we have to ask ourselves about any phrase that we play is, what is the culmination of the phrase? What is, a sentence needs to have a focal point. So too a musical sentence, a phrase. We have to decide, and to do that, there are many questions we can ask ourselves, and it depends on the style, it depends on the music, it depends on the piece. again, we're going to go back to the HMMR. We have considerations of harmony, melody, markings of the composer that sometimes tell us clear indication of where they want the culmination of the phrase to be, and the rhythm. In the case of Bach, specifically in the case of this phrase in this music, I think the three most important things we should consider are the melody, where there's a clear melodic line, the harmony, and the bass. Now, what we will end up having a lot of times happen in Bach and in many pieces of music is that there could be a contradiction between if we were to choose to emphasize what the melody, the combination of the melody, or the harmony, or the bass, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of times we have to make choices. In the specific case of this piece, of this phrase, I think that mostly there's a convergence of all these elements. So now we're going to go into looking in depth into some why questions. When we come to look at the why questions when playing Bach solo music, in general when playing any music, but especially with Bach's music, we have access to Bach's original manuscript, which is available for free online, so there is no excuses for anyone for not looking at it. And a lot of times manuscripts tell a story because it is not a machine producing the music, but rather the hand of the composer. A lot of times if we have corrections and things like that, not necessarily in this music, but in other music, that can give us a lot of indication to the process of the composer. So my first question of why is why those connecting phrases between the harmonies. We know that Bach has many pieces where the harmonic structure is really the central focal point without those connecting phrases. So why does Bach write those connecting phrases again? And I think a lot of the answer could be seen in looking at the manuscript. If we looked at the manuscript in this phrase, we see that those connecting phrases, they really look like gestures. They look like a free improvisational element between the structure of the harmony and the chords. Second question is, if we look at the chords, we can see that they are written not like we expect chords to look like, but rather like 4 or 3 separate notes written one above the other. Why is that? And when we look at Bach's music, we come at it from our perspective of harmony and analysis and all that. But the truth is, when Bach was writing this music, he was coming at it much more from a voice leading and counterpoint perspective rather than those clear harmonic structures that we think of nowadays. So that's something to consider when looking at the music, that perhaps sometimes the voice leading is more important to Bach than the harmonic tensions that we like to think of as in blocks in our day and age. And when we take all of that into account, at the end of the day, do we want to emphasize? Do we want to take the melody and bring that out the most? Do we want to take those harmonic blocks and bring out the tension between them? Or do we want to take the bass and emphasize the bass? There's no one answer to these questions, but those are questions that when we come to look at this music, we must ask ourselves. So now we get to the how. The how is where really a lot of our practice happens, a lot of our process happens. So the first how I think we should ask ourselves in this music is, how do we play the chords? The harmonies and the voice leading are such an integral part of Bach's music. They're kind of the bread and butter of it all. So how do we do that? The truth is, there's no one right answer. We could break the chords, we could roll the chords, and we can do some different versions between that, or perhaps sometimes do this, sometimes do that, depending on what is it we want to bring out in any specific spot. So that's question number one. And to take those chords and kind of decide how we're going to play them. Then we come to the connecting phrases. How do we do that? If our goal is to emphasize the melody, then that may affect how we play these connecting phrases as one long melody, versus if we see those connecting phrases simply as gestures between those harmonic blocks, then that is going to affect how we play those phrases. Also, as we said, those are free and improvisational gestures. My old teacher in Peabody, Violin Sonata, liked to say about the rhythm that is the closest approximation between what the composer had in his mind and writing out precise rhythms. And I think in this kind of music it very much is applicable, because we cannot play those connecting phrases as metronomic material. Rather, it has to be a free-flowing, natural gesture. So how do we do that? How do we find that natural ebb and flow? Then there's a question of how we're going to treat the bowings and the slurs. I remember in the old school, the old Russian school that I learned with, there is a general idea that Bach wanted everything to sound like an organ, and that we should sustain the notes as much as possible, and that the slurs are really not meant in the way we understand slurs exactly, and that we should keep the sound, the Baroque bows that they had at the time. The fact that they couldn't do it is because they were deficient, and we, now that we have our modern bows, should do differently. And the truth is, what Bach would write if he had the ability to write for modern bows is a fantastic question, but we're never going to know the answer to that question. But what we do know is that Bach did know what bows at his time could do, and that he did write slurs knowing that knowledge, and that those slurs must have had in mind what the ability of the bow at the time of Bach was. So we should probably not sustain in the same way that we would be sustaining notes and slurs as if we're playing Tchaikovsky. At the same time, how much to release, how much not to release, again, there's a very wide range of options, and there is a question of taste, and there's a question of finding the right balance for each person. So how do we practice this? First of all, we need to take the chords and practice each chord separately, and practice also the progression of the chords between them, because again, we always want, when we phrase, to emphasize harmonic tension and to have a release on the resolution. Okay, so here we start with a tonic, and then we have two chords with higher tension, and then we have again the release. So we want to play the chords in terms of our bow usage in a way that allows us to express that. Regardless what element it is that we want to emphasize the most, that is undeniably something that we must bring out. So practicing the chords separately. Then practicing just the melody without the chords, just the melody with a metronome, so that we can understand the rhythmic relationships that Bach wrote. And once we get that, then we want to step back away from it, so that we can have the ebb and flow, the natural free flowing, while taking what is written in the music into consideration. Not just free flowing because I feel like it, but rather understanding kind of the general gist of rhythmic relationships that Bach wrote and applying it in a way. And that there's a process of search and exploration with that. And the this is not something that needs to necessarily be the exact same every time, and it will not be the same every single time. It is a process of exploration. It's a process of musical adventure, if you may. And then, after we do all of that, to take the chords and the connecting phrases and put them all together into one phrase that makes sense in terms of its sound, its tone, its line from beginning to end. Whether we want the melody to be one long gesture or rather separate gestures between the different harmonies, and put it all together. Thank you so much. I will see you next time.